Participant wanting to be recorded can turn off their camera. To introduce the panelists, each panelist please share their name, preferred pronouns, and job title and organization, favorite insect, and how their work relates to insects, please.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Devin. Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Michelson. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with a nonprofit organization called the Xerces Society, which is dedicated to the conservation of invertebrates in their habitats. I'm also a partner biologist with the USDA NRCS. So in that role, I provide conservation planning assistance to land managers seeking to develop pollinator and beneficial insect habitat, with my main role assisting livestock producers. So increasingly, we're talking about strategies to conserve beneficial insect groups like dung beetles and natural enemies of fly pests out in pasture as well. I also do a lot of outreach and training for professional and general audiences on insect conservation on topics like pollinators or aquatic macroinvertebrates, or dung beetles, as another example. My favorite insect tends to be whatever I saw last. I think as a trend, ants are probably my absolute favorite for the interesting behaviors that come with sociality, and then all the interactions with other organisms that rely on some byproduct of ant activity. One genus in particular, the spine-waisted ants in the genus Aphenogaster, I feel really fond towards because they're are primarily responsible for seed dispersal of spring ephemerals, as an example, like bloodroot and trillium in eastern deciduous forests. So I think that's just super cool. And yeah, I think hopefully that answers all the questions.
Hello, Spencer Hardy, he, him. I'm a pollination biologist with the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. I've been working here for the better part of 10 years, looking at bees, from bumblebees to the tiny native bees. Dabbled in other insects here and there, but my main expertise is wild native bees. And I also co-own a diversified organic farm in Jericho. Um, so I'm seeing bees both from the natural history biodiversity standpoint and now from a pollination standpoint, making sure our plums and apples are pollinated. Favorite insect at the moment has got to be the ground cherry fairy bee, the tiny 3 millimeter solitary bee. Very easy to overlook, but also pretty colorful and fascinating up close. And I also really like ground cherries and tomatillos.
Hey everyone, I'm Mark Ferguson. I'm a wildlife biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I guess my other title is within the department. I'm in our Natural Heritage Inventory program as a primary zoologist. And that's where we manage a lot of the rare species information that comes to our department. Favorite insect? That's a really hard question. That we could spend this whole hour and a half on that. I guess I would say when I was young, I was really fascinated and still am with cicadas. I lived in a part of the country where we had a number of species. It's a little hard to find more than one here in Vermont at a time, but there are just some really interesting ones out there. But it's kind of like Julie said, it's whatever I'm looking at the time. But in my role in my department, I guess I'm basically the primary contact for anything related to invertebrates, which is a lot to handle, but it also gives me one of the most interesting jobs in my department, I think, because I get just such a diversity of things that I get to work on. So my main focus is working on rare species and endangered species, and not only collecting that data, but also applying it when we're doing environmental reviews and actually applying it to conservation of habitats and species. So, that's the kind of connection we have with gathering that data for actually applying it on the landscape. And I also get to run some projects. We have some federal money that we use for large-scale projects and endangered species work, and I've been able to partially fund some statewide projects, including some of the bee work that Spencer's done. Also, Butterfly Atlas. I do a lot of that work with a partner, Vermont Center for Eco Studies, who are just really great at running those large-scale projects. So that's kind of what I do.
I think it's me, right? Hey, everybody. My name is Vic Izzo. I'm a faculty member in the Agriculture, Landscape, and Environment Department at the University of Vermont. And by training, I guess I'm an agricultural entomologist. So I spend most of my time on farms, primarily focused on pest management, actually, though I often think of it as kind of herbivore management in some ways. Both pollinators are herbivores, and of course, our leaf-feeding organisms are also herbivores too. So yeah, so I spend most of my time kind of working with farmers trying to come up with ways to enact agroecological approaches to pest management. My favorite insect in that case would be the Colorado potato beetle, which I feel like put horror in everyone's face goes, "Oh my God, you like that beetle? That's the worst." But the reality is it's like an evolutionary marvel in my estimation. It's overcome like 150 different pesticide chemistries in a very short period of time. And so in its pest behavior is a quite kind of marvelous evolutionary dynamics, and it kind of really, it's fascinating to me. And anyway, so that's my long and short of it. So this is really exciting for me. I really love just hearing all these wonderful, super intelligent folks having the opportunity to just discuss kind of insects in the broader concept of ecosystems management, etc. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Cheers.
Should I go? Am I next? Okay. So I'm Michael Severin. I'm not really fond of pronouns, but I can go with he. As far as job and representation, it's two separate things. I work for the state as a health technician. That means I do the taking mosquito surveys when people complain about AAA and everything. I'm like the one responsible for that in a sense. But and I'm representing Vermont Entomological Society. But my favorite insect is probably a genus or a family, which would be tortricid moths. I'm basically known as a Microlepidopterus, and how my work relates to insects is that when people do biological surveys and all those kind of things and are looking for names for things, I am someone that they consult with. Like currently I'm working with the province of Quebec. They're doing a field guide to Microlepidopter, and I'm helping them straighten out the tortricid names. I mean, tortricid is unlike bees and other groups. The names don't always apply to reality, so I help with that aspect.
Excellent. Thank you. To start the questions for the panelists, I'll ask, what are insects' roles in Vermont's different ecosystems?
So to not, steal the thunder from everyone and just list a whole bunch of roles, I'm going to, I think, talk about one specific, which is decomposers, and not only for the way they shape, nutrient recycling and more broadly our environment, but how they give rise to other opportunities for wildlife. Just because I think that's something that's maybe not admired for our decomposers too much, like xylophagus beetles, like the longhorn beetles, so wood-feeding beetles. They're boring tunnels into the wood, which give opportunities for secondary colonizers to come in and use those excavated tunnels for things like nesting, which some of our native bees will nest in, overwintering, as well as just enabling more access to those resources, like creating more surface area for fungus to come in and continue that decomposition process. So maybe a little bit of a underrated benefit, but yeah, decomposers I just think are undervalued overall.
And I guess as a pollination biologist, I really have to talk about bees and bee pollination. Um, Bees being perhaps the most important pollinator in most terrestrial ecosystems, and then at least in North America. There's plenty of other insects that are also doing a lot of pollination, but in agricultural and wild landscapes. Um, a lot of our wildflowers, a lot of our trees are dependent on insect pollination. Certainly, plenty of them exist with surviving with wind pollination, especially a lot of our commodity crops. Most of our calories are probably wind pollinated, but a lot of the fun fruits and the pretty wildflowers are need insect pollen mediated pollination, moving pollen from either from male flowers to female flowers or between populations to increase genetic diversity. Um, and then I'll also add that bees, like Vic said, are herbivores, and they are the base of a pretty complicated, complex, massive food web. Everything likes to eat bees in one form or another, or steal the pollen that the bees have collected themselves. So there's moths and beetles and wasps and flies and just about any group of insect you can think of that is somehow taking advantage of the hard work that bees are doing. And you get a lot of diversity coming out of relatively small number of bee species. I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, that's great. It's such a big question, you know. Insects they're among some of the most diverse, you know, the most diverse groups of organisms on Earth, really. Um, and you know, in being so, they've evolved to serve, you know, countless roles in terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, especially. So, you know, they're serving the big one, you know, you think of is food. You know, people see insects on the landscape, and that's kind of their vision of what insects are. Is I see a big moth, or I see a hole in a plant in my garden, that sort of thing. But you know, just the biomass of insects on the landscape is really such a central role, not by in their eyes, but central role of what insects are in the ecosystem. So I think that's just a really important thing, and we're hearing a lot about biomass changes now. So you know, it's important to recognize that role. They're predators as well. You know, they are controlling other invertebrate populations, um, and you know, you've heard some other roles. I think the seed dispersal is an interesting one because some of those plants would have a hard time germinating without some of those insects that do that work. And the decomposers, I think that's one of the most coolest things, because you think about what the landscape might look like if we didn't have those decomposers doing that work. So, you know, to me, I just think that if there's a role in the ecosystem that a small animal can do, insects have probably evolved to have someone filling that niche. So they're really vital to ecosystem health.
So I feel like we've covered a lot of the bases of the basic ecological functions for ecosystems management. I think it's awesome. And so I was thinking kind of what unique ways do they serve human populations or can serve ecosystems via their connections to humans? And going to a lot of entomological Society of America conferences, the fascination with insects that just kind of folks who just show up at the conference who just love insects and their charisma that they have and the diversity of that. I think we that charismatic characteristic that people love insects has really benefited the protection of ecosystems. Like it's generated lots of money and protection through the Xerces Society and all that segment. So I feel like just them being fascinating in that diversity serves the protection of those. I worked in conservation for a long period of time in turtles, and when I always was fascinated how just having a little hatchling on a beach would then protect an entire ecosystem. And so I feel like that fascination, and including all the other things that everyone talked about, is really important. But I think just the pure diversity that leads to fascination and thereby leads to some amount of protection and investment in protecting those ecosystems to protect that wonderful diversity that everyone loves is another kind of, I guess, underappreciated characteristic of populations of insects. crickets. See what I did there?
I was going to say, I'll speak on Lepidoptera. We all know that Lepidoptera is a major source of food for bats. There's a very good association there. Also, with birds, geometric caterpillars is a well-known food source for birds, and there's also been a documented decrease in bird populations in coinciding with the decrease in insect population. So everybody likes birding, and insects are a big part of birding. And there's to go also what Vic said, there's also an aesthetic value. I mean, along with the conservation and everything, there's there's art involved. I mean, moths and butterflies and everything. It's very catching to folks. And then there's also material products like silkworms and clothing and stuff like that. So all in all, insects play a big part in our everyday lives.
One other quick thing to shout out, since mentioning birds, is aquatic macroinvertebrates, of course, not only for what they feed for bird populations, but also for freshwater fish, and for human value, freshwater game fish, and all the ways that they shape food webs. They're really at the base, providing a tremendous amount of biomass, also shaping, of course, how nutrients flow through aquatic systems and bringing nutrients from aquatic systems to terrestrial environments, and all those sorts of ways that aquatic macroinvertebrates tend to, fly under our radar, that are tremendously important.
If I can throw one more in, just for fun fact, a lot of parts of the world, they eat insects, right? We don't really do a lot of that here, at least not on purpose. But we don't, well, I would say we don't think we do, but there are connections. And one I would point to would be, if you like chocolates, the shiny glaze that you have on your chocolates has an insect connection. You might look that up.
Okay.
Thanks, guys. You guys started to touch a little bit on the decline in insect populations, and that's something I'd really like to dive into for the next section of our talk. So, as we did some research into insect populations, you see these really scary headlines like mass extinction of insects and Insectageddon, and all of our insects are gonna go away. I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the research behind insect declines, as well as, I know there's some debate over the rate of decline in insects. I'm curious what you guys know about this research. How do you even begin to measure insect population declines when there's so many insects? And what have you guys observed in your own lives and your own research related to insect populations and their changes? That's a lot of questions in one.
Yeah, hopefully tackle at least one of them. But those are all great questions. My impression is that a lot of the internal debate between scientists is not whether there are declines that warrant attention or action, but to what degree and speed are we seeing declines. And there's a lot of challenges that give rise to this debate, like just developing a comprehensive understanding of a diverse group of organisms and how they're responding to many complex ecological factors. And then on top of that, we lack a lot of the basic science, even just basic life history of so many organisms or historical ranges and abundances that make it challenging to piece together. But for me, the data that we do have is very convincing that at least immediate action is needed for the factors that have very apparent negative effects on insect populations, like habitat loss and degradation or pesticide use. I also think looking at charismatic species, like the monarch butterfly as an example, and seeing very clear declines in those species that have received so much attention is reason enough just to be alert about what this research is saying. because species don't exist in a vacuum. They're subject to factors that are influencing many other organisms as well that likely aren't receiving our attention. Another, I guess I'm going to bring up aquatic macroinvertebrates again, because one of the studies that I think is very compelling that looks at mayfly populations in the Midwest. And mayflies can have these synchronized emergences that can be recorded with Doppler weather radar, so they can really have a good measurement of biomass. And it's also a little bit more of an easy way to track populations over time than going out into the field. And so this study, which came out, I think, in 2020 or so, found that the biomasses have declined by around 50% in the upper Midwest. So like mayflies, they're indicators of water quality. They can tell us so much about aquatic ecosystems overall. And, aquatic ecosystems are so diverse, and then how they influence terrestrial ecosystems. Nothing exists in a bubble. So I just think it's something that warrants our attention and at least some action.
I totally agree with everything you just said. And then from the bee perspective, there's evidence showing declines at multiple levels or multiple geographic scales. One antidote that scares me, cracks me up, I'm not totally sure, but during some testimony on the recent neonicotinoid bill in the Vermont House, a golf course executive brought up our research suggesting that there's 350 species of bees in Vermont now, and 10 years ago there were only 275. Therefore, the bees are doing great.
Spencer.
Clearly, an ulterior motives, but does go to show that we really don't have Vermont-specific historical data to say much meaningful about the changes in bee diversity and abundance. Certainly not going back hundreds of years like we wish we could. We found a lot of species when we started looking for them in the last 5 years. They've almost certainly been here the whole time, at least most of them. The one bee taxa where we have more information is the bumblebees, the big charismatic fuzzy ones that we've been studying for over a decade now. And there's more historical records in museum collections than there are of some of these smaller bees. And what we see there is a marked simplification of the bumblebee diversity in Vermont in like the late 1990s. Couple possible explanations, but several species that disappeared, other species that declined in relative abundance pretty drastically, and then a few species that increased in relative abundance, not necessarily total abundance, but relative abundance compared to other bumblebees. So instead of there being 5 species in every 10 individuals you collect, now there's maybe only 2 species in every 10 individuals. And that's happened within my lifetime. It's been pretty well documented. But beyond that, we really don't have a lot of local data to say much about bee populations. I wish we could.
Well, I can speak anecdotally on Lepidoptera. I mean, I've been active for different decades, and I was thinking today, I went around the yard once and I walked down to the mailbox and back, and I think in that time, I got like a couple of acres and my yard's not mowed, not because there's no mow me, it's because we never get to mow it because of our schedules and stuff like that. But certainly the yard is full of flowering plants, bluets, dandelions, whatever. And I'm just trying to say, within that walk, I saw like, 4 butterflies, and I've been out a number of times this year, and I hate non-activity. Like I hate going out for 4 hours and seeing 2 butterflies or something like that. But that just seems like how it's been this year. Where when I grew up in the 1960s, the whole side of the house I grew up in was covered with chrysalises and cocoons and all that kind of stuff. And we talked about the, recent, population declines and stuff like that. There's obviously a big decline in the 60s due to DDT, and maybe it's been gradual since then. And then there's other things that affect things that we don't tend to think about, like we don't really know organisms' personal relationships with their with their cohorts, like parasites and whatnot. And whatever, a few other things. Things like light pollution, we talk about that. We don't really know how it affects things mathematically. There's also competition from immigrant and non-native species. And I mentioned parasitic relationships, and then there's electromagnet pollution. We don't really know how 5G really affects organisms, but there might be some effect that we don't even think of.
Yeah, and I'll chime in. Yes, kind of, what Spencer was saying there about the state of where we are in Vermont. We're really just getting started on some of these large projects to kind of get a baseline for future comparisons. That's pretty normal. That's where a lot of states are. In fact, we're kind of leading the show for some of these groups. And that's kind of the state of things is we just don't really have a lot of long-term continuous data to try to answer this question. And I'd say that's probably global. I work with rare species for the most part. I don't really have a lot of expertise on what's happening with biomass itself, but I think that is a big question. And really this question breaks into two pieces in my mind, and you've heard both of those already. Is there's the diversity of insects out there, and how is that being affected over time? And then there's biomass. How many insects do we have, regardless of the diversity? They're interlinked, but I think it's two questions that really we have to consider. Are we losing just biomass? Are we losing species, or both? But there has been a lot of research, and especially in the last 10 years or so, I think it's really started to get some attention. But still, most of these are short-term data sets. 30 years or so. We're doing our second butterfly atlas right now, so that's 20 years of data. I think that's pretty good, but still, it takes a long time to answer some of these questions. But even so, there was a recent paper that came out that used the kind of information that we're gathering now. It's community science gathered information, and the authors took community science project or programs from around the country. I think they had over 50 different ones that they could collect data from and try to get a handle on what was happening with butterflies. And they reported a 22% decline in the numbers of butterflies. And they saw most species were on a species level were suffering declines as well. I think 2/3 or so had at least a 10% decline. And that's butterflies, and that's easy to collect compared to a lot of other insects, because people see them, they can recognize them, most of them. So it's a great starting point, but it's just hard to get some good long-term data for a lot of these species.
Thanks, Mark and Spencer, for bringing attention to kind of how we do not have a good data set for a lot of these measurements to provide a good estimation for. And even if we did, the problem I have, I think that this question is this idea is just a little, in scale, it's too large, right? And I think because it's directional in the sense that we're asking whether something is decreasing or increasing, that is kind of in my mind, kind of like a dead end, kind of. If I said insects were increasing, or if we had evidence that showed that insects were increasing, that wouldn't change any of the work that we are all doing here to help support insect populations, to help identify all the important things that they do, right? So all the things that they do is amazing, and we need them, and we will continue to do the work. And I want to continue to shine a light on the importance of insects. I sometimes find that these large scale questions, because we don't have good data sets, makes us really vulnerable to anecdotal evidence to show the opposite. And it puts us in a really vulnerable position. As soon as someone shows a study that says, look, it's increasing in Long Island, right? And so everyone's saying insect populations are declining. Look, I've just debunked that or just pointing to how the data sets aren't great, which they're not, right? There's a data set from a good friend of mine that he went out and he looked at all the long-term experimental research centers across the country. And he measured all the insect through time, right? All the changes in insect diversity through time. And what he basically, or abundance through time, I'm sorry. And what he saw was there was no net change when he averaged across all the long-term experimental research. But him and I both agree that insects were declining in certain areas or very important areas, and diversity was declining in very important areas. But then when we take this big generalized question and we average across the globe, it paints a picture of no, well, in this case, no net change. And I feel like that really makes us, like I said before, really vulnerable to people throwing that in the face and saying that science is showing that there's no net. And there's other types of data which are the opposite of that, right? And so what I would, from my perspective, I think we're asking kind of the wrong questions. And what I think is an important question to ask is, how are insect populations changing in different environments? So rather than doing this kind of asking questions through time, more focusing on questions that look across different types of land uses, looking across through space, right? And using gradients and looking how gradients are changing. Because we know abiotic environments are changing because of our land use. We're getting changes in nitrification is changing. We're getting changes in use of pesticides, but they're across a gradient. Not everyone's using the same way. Not everyone's using the same on farms. And if we could detail how insects are changing in space, and I'm not saying that it's not important to understand the rates through time, but I think we're so obsessed with this idea of through time, and we don't have the data to support what we obviously are seeing in small areas. I bet if we had really good data sets, we'd see insects declining, definitely. But because we don't have the really good data sets, I think we should be more focusing on and propping up these questions of abiotic impacts, space, and substituting these time experiments with space through time, substituting time experiments with space experiments. And I think that's where I'd like to see things go in this case, because I think what I'm experiencing on farms, I'm certainly seeing huge differences on farms that are having certain practices. And I'm not talking about like conventional versus organic, whatever it may be. Certain organic growers are using certain types of sprays and having certain types of land use, certain types of diversity, and I'm seeing huge differences. And it's not through time; it's actually just through land use. And so I just feel like that sometimes is difficult for me to like that seeing all in the headlines these declines through time, these long-term trends, and then people just throw it in our face, and it's difficult to overcome that because there's always going to be an anecdotal study that can really work against us in supporting insect population. So anyways, I know that might be a provocative comment, but check.
That actually leads us very nicely into my next question, which was clearly things don't all change uniformly in response to climatic changes. Like, what species do we see benefiting from habitat changes and insecticides? Like Vic, you mentioned the potato beetle and how it's able to overcome these pesticides and evolve. How are these changes affecting insect populations in different ways on different scales? Yeah, thank you for leading into my next question so perfectly.
Well, if I can just quickly touch on that, one thing you see with Lepidoptera is a greater increase in non-native species. I mean, let people say there's not a lot of baseline data for things, but I can go out during the year and collect various things, and probably the component of things that are not native is like 25%, 50%, and some of those are innocuous, like daisy, fleabane, or oxeye daisy, those kind of things. But still, they compete with native species, and so non-native species are certainly probably doing better than native species in that regard.
Yeah, I guess to kind of follow up with that thought, specifically with warming temperatures and shifting ranges, I think of that being beneficial for some species, even native species that maybe have an expanded range. More cold adapted species will be pushed northward. Of course, you can only pushed so north where their habitat and co-evolved plants may not exist, but you have that shifting in communities that's going on, which can be beneficial for some and detrimental for others. With invasive species like the brown marmorated stink bug, as an example, a non-native stink bug that's a generalist, pest for a variety of fruit and veggie operations. But right now is really, sort of constrained by its inability to tolerate cold winters. And it really thrives, in areas that have either more mild winters or have, developments that they can reside in to endure the winter. But I definitely see, as temperatures increase, as mean temperatures increase, that expanded range of that non-native species also following suit. And then, of course, all the production chaos that goes in when you have the introduction of a new pest species. I also wanted to, talking about Lepidoptera was making me think of something that I've been personally fretting over, which is beech leaf disease. And there's a specialist butterfly, the early hair streak, that really relies on beeches as well as some hazelnuts that I've just been thinking, those specialists where they have such a tightly, such a dependency on a certain type of plant, and then you have some sort of disruption to that relationship, how catastrophic that can be for a species.
Yeah, well, second that comment about specialists versus generalists. There's a lot of, I don't know, 75% of the bees in Vermont are generalists, 25% being specialized on a small number of flowering plants. And some of the generalists are more specialized than others, but things like bumblebees, and a lot of our sweat bees can seem perfectly content feeding on nectar and pollen from any number of garden variety ornamentals, as well as wildflowers, as well as invasives, even on Japanese knotweed and some of these. They're not picky in what they eat. So and a good example of this is the eastern carpenter bee, Xylocopa virginiana, which was first detected in Vermont in like 2006 or 2008. It's now all the way up to Swanton and throughout eastern Vermont. I get people always asking me about this new bee that showed up that started drilling holes in their house. They really like to nest in untreated or rough sawn lumber. So there's no shortage of houses for them to nest in, and they seem to be happy in garden flowers. And as temperature's warm, it seems like they're really making hay. Um, whereas some of the specialist bees are, yeah, like this that butterfly you mentioned are probably more likely to suffer from the landscape changes that we're seeing, as well as climatic changes.
Yeah, early hair streak is one we've been keeping our eye on for a while. We've got it in our wildlife action plan, and that was even back when it was just beech bark disease that we were concerned about. Now we're really concerned because this looks like a really nasty one. This in Vermont now, this new beech leaf disease. But yeah, just talking about weather, it seems like research is showing weather conditions are a strong influencer on, on any biomass changes in insects that we might be seeing. Meaning that changing conditions such as drier, hotter weather, that could be influencing or impacting these populations. In fact, that butterfly study I mentioned, I think that the worst declines they saw were in parts of the country where it was getting hotter and drier, which makes a lot of sense when you think about that interrelation between the plants that they need and these insects. Yeah, and I think it was a good point about local differences, Vic. And how you really need kind of a widespread data set if you're going to look at these larger scale potential impacts, and variety of habitats, and just making sure you're covering all the bases. But I guess when I think of global shifts in insect populations, I kind of think of pervasive activities, especially human influenced activities, like is there a new pesticide that's been introduced that we really don't know what the long-term impacts are going to be, or even enhanced pesticide use over time. Large-scale habitat loss that might be happening just because of a type of land use that's changing across the landscape, and even pollution. Pollution should be considered also as a potential one. It's a hard one to get your finger on because there's no smoking gun a lot of times. Occasionally there's with DDT. That was one we got our hands on, but this is a tough one.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's death by a thousand cuts, as everyone is kind of says, especially around pollinators, right? Yeah, and I think the thing that keeps me up at night that I think is kind of a blind spot, not for you folks, but I think for a lot of kind of folks that are typically reading a lot of this, especially kind of popular science reading around insect declines, is kind of the non-lethal levels of pesticide usage. Like I find it really, it's unfair that we determine a lot of the safety, especially to insect or other animals, based upon a way of LD50, right? So we look at basically how we determine how toxic it is. We provide that pesticide, and we apply it to a certain population of insects or animals, and we see what's the dosage at 50% of them die, right? And then we scale back based upon that number. But if there was something, we all do it as humans, right? We wouldn't take something that was going to reduce our likelihood for getting, or increase our likelihood for getting a disease, right? But it's not going to kill us. We still ban those things, right? We're banning all sorts of dyes and stuff like that based upon the impacts that we know are non-lethal, and there's tons of them. And I think that all of the pesticide industry and how it provides the rates you're supposed to use on certain plants based upon their impact on pollinators, other types of insects, are way too high. Because they're based upon lethality. And I think that, like, we know that some of these non-lethal doses cause bees to not be able to recognize flower colors, or cause predators to not be able to recognize their prey. It's really destabilizing in a way that we have no idea. The same way we think about like microplastics, right? We have no idea how deeply it's affecting kind of the functioning of ecosystems based upon the behavior of insects. And that's kind of the thing that I'm really worried about. And I think I don't think there's enough brought to the attention of the average public around the use that just the common person is going out and spraying their plants and saying, look, it's safe. I followed the instructions. And there's bees still here. The bee, I even sprayed a bee, it didn't die. I actually had a friend tell me that. Like, what are you doing? And but that bee is going to bring it back to the hive, and they're just going to act differently, or who knows, like with the long-term effects of that on an individual, let alone a whole population. So that's kind of what keeps me up at night, as far as kind of the blind spots that we have.
A lot about the very complex and interconnected roles that insects play in our ecosystems, and how their changing populations will touch so many different parts of our ecosystems. I'm wondering if there are other short or long-term consequences that we haven't touched on yet that you guys that's really on your mind, or just other long or short-term consequences of changing insect populations, or changing climate, and other related things you have on your mind to close out this section of the chat.
One, my stress levels are going to increase in the short term. I also think of, for the farmers that I work with, how production costs, just because of how indispensable insects are in any ecosystem, including agricultural ecosystems, for their role in, of course, pollination, but pest control services, decomposition, all those sorts of things, that are pretty much flying under the radar, I think, for a lot of farmers, that they don't know just how much insects are probably saving them year to year. So definitely, declines leading to issues with our food systems, higher production costs for farmers, and just overall a little bit more uncertainty with the reliability of production. I also, kind of on that reliability thought of if you have areas where you're having reductions in diversity in particular. Diversity is an insurance policy that if you have so many different organisms that are all providing, these different services, and there's like this group of organisms that are all, able to pollinate this type of plant or something like that. If you have something that disturbs one population or one species, then you hopefully have other species that can help fill that niche so the ecosystem service persists. But then when you have that decline in diversity, it's going to be, a lot more sensitive to any disturbance, and you lose that resiliency. And that's where I think the long-term effects where, our like entire food webs potentially being at risk.
I think I think one part of the food web we haven't mentioned yet is aquatic vertebrates in the sense of, fisheries and fishing and all those kind of things. I mean, that ties into the tourist industry somewhat. So, I mean, certainly the tourist industry is affected by insect populations.
I don't have a lot to add on this one, but I guess I will say that I'm fairly optimistic about Vermont maintaining a sufficient abundance of pollinators to pollinate most of our agricultural and backyard crops. I mean, there's exceptions to that, and um, in some scales and in some places in the state, there's pollination deficiencies, but there's so many generalist species on the landscape now, and a diversity of native species that hopefully that can be resilient to a fair amount of change that we throw at it. Um, but yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, and I'll just go back again to the point that insects play so many roles that are hard to define in the ecosystem. So it's kind of hard to know exactly what the impacts might be, because it's more like you're talking about, well, how much can you tinker with the system before something breaks? Because really it's going to be a matter of what realizing the impacts, what are we able to notice on the landscape and then tie it back? And that's kind of a hard thing to do, or could be a hard thing to do. But certainly there are things we can point to that humans understand. And I think, things like crop pollination disruption is one. Like you said, we're kind of lucky here in Vermont because I think we had this in mind. And I feel kind of spoiled in Vermont sometimes, and like, am I living in a bubble? Because I know it's not like this across the rest of the country. So I think we have it pretty good here. So it's really, I'm thinking more outside of Vermont, really, what's going to be happening, especially where you have, these large scale agricultural fields that just go on and on and on, where there's really not much there. So, yeah, things like, shifting the diet in insect predators, like Michael mentioned earlier, with birds. Birds can shift if they need to, but how far can that go? We're already seeing reports of bird populations declining and some potential links with declining inverts as well. So, at least in the long term, and maybe we're seeing that in the short term already. But that and of course extinctions if it gets to the point where, again, talking, Spencer, you talk about generalists and specialists. I think the specialists are probably going to be the ones that are more likely to take a hit. Generalists can shift a bit more. So yeah, you could be talking about losing species at a faster rate, I should say, than we are now.
Well, just anecdotally, as far as birds, I mean, I can go outside all summer here and not see a swallow or a bat, and both are primary insect feeders. So I think there are statistics that support declining insects, and I don't think we're as maybe rosy as some people project us because even though we don't have a lot of baseline data, we do know that things are changing. And I was thinking earlier, we have all this, with the electric vehicles and gas and the air pollution and everything, but I don't think we're up to speed in the same sense with how pollution affects our everyday lives and environment around us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have a ton to add, but I will kind of underscore what people are saying with kind of how Vermont is unique. Just speaking from working with lots of different growers, um, this idea of like a conventional grower in Vermont is hilarious to me because most of the conventional growers, at least veg growers that I work with, are not spraying anything. I mean, they have like a break glass if needed kind of approach, and it's for their livelihoods. But they're amazing stewards of the land and are much more deeply entrenched in some of the data and the understanding of insects, particularly with pollinators than I am. And so the short term or long term effects here, like I'm kind of hopeful in this area just because of how people are tending to the and yeah. So I don't have much to add. I have a myopic view, I guess. Yeah. Check.
Alrighty, thank you guys so much for that insight. I think we're going to move on to our next section, which is going to be mitigation. So our first question will be, how can everyday people help mitigate the decline in insect populations? And for example, community science initiatives, backyard plantings. I know we just started our own caterpillar count station here at our center in Audubon in Huntington.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, definitely habitat on the ground where you're filling in spaces that are not providing, any necessarily valuable resource for anybody, is definitely a great place to really focus our efforts. I also, personally, I feel something that, makes a big difference is just how you spend your money and supporting, producers, in particular farmers that you've developed relationships with, that you have trust and confidence in their practices, that are producing healthy and nutritious food, and thinking about wildlife too, and supporting them, rewarding them for that level of thoughtfulness, if you can. Being understanding as well of those food prices reflecting all the work that goes into producing, especially with wildlife in mind. Another thing, I guess just, yeah, broadly, like I think you mentioned community science. I always recommend the general public to download iNaturalist, and if they spend any time outdoors, be curious about what you're seeing, take pictures. Even if you know what it is, it's still valuable to add. I think that's kind of maybe one of the pitfalls, is that like once you know what it is, then you don't keep adding it, but it's still really helpful, records of species across the world. So definitely community science platforms like iNaturalist, just for recording species observations.
I'm also a huge fan of community science, especially iNaturalist. It's a big part of our work. Biggest data source for bees in Vermont as of like a year ago. But I'm also a big proponent of backyard landscaping and native plants, and talk more about that if we want. But I wanted to double down on the consumer aspect because I feel like that often gets overlooked in these conversations. And the other day I was preparing for a talk and I went to my pantry and I pulled out a box of Honey Nut Cheerios, had a nice picture of a bee on the front, and I looked at the ingredient list, and like three-quarters of the ingredients were grown almost certainly with neonicotinoids. All the corn, the sugar beets, even the honey is a whole controversial topic I could get into, but not necessarily a great thing for bee diversity and pollination and insect diversity globally. So just thinking about that end of how we spend our money, because I mean, if people weren't buying conventionally grown grains, people wouldn't be growing conventionally grown grains. Um, I know it's hard to switch to an affordable local options, but um, I think that's a big way that we can do our bit to help change change the picture, and especially with fruit production. So many of our fruits are grown with a fair amount of pesticides, insecticides, often sprayed on flowers that are attractive to bees. I know I spent some time working in almond orchards in California, where every time it rains, they fly a plane over and fungicide the whole orchard, even if there's during bloom, because there's a pesticide that they need to deal with, or a fungus they need to deal with, and they're hitting the bees that are out there. Um, Easy to overlook, easy not to think about, but it's a little bit scary.
I don't really have much to add. You guys have touched on pretty much everything I was going to say. So, I just support the ideas you've heard already. I'd say as far as managing your own property, I would say, if you can minimize your lawn, minimize the amount of landscape maintenance that you have to do, this is going to be an improvement. And if you can have places that you can just kind of leave, there are important spots, types of habitat that may not look like it's the way most people want their lawns to be. But if you happen to have a bare piece of ground and you notice in the spring bees nesting, because most of our bees do nest in the ground, just consider leaving that. Don't mess with it, and let the bees have that spot. Some bees nest in broken stems. I think, Spencer, it's like after a year, that once they're dried out, I think is when they use them. But most people don't think about leaving, like goldenrod that's been there for a year, but you can like cut it in half, whatever works. And it doesn't have to be like this is my display in my front on the street, but find a spot where it works and see if they use that kind of thing. So it's just kind of that mindset of getting away from lawn, starting to think about managing your property for landscape. Because I think really the biggest part of this is just awareness. I think thinking about it, like you heard, just thinking about insects, the role they play, and this issue in general. Because if we can get people to start thinking that way, then I think they're automatically going to start looking for ways that they can help. And it can work. I mean, in my job, I go back to my family and tell them what I do, and they say, "Oh, you have an interesting job. That's great." And then it's whatever. But I just keep coming back with a new story. Here's this, here's that. And eventually, one of my sisters has been sending me pictures and say, "What is this? What is this? What is this?" I say, "Hey, let's put it on iNaturalist." And look, there's your name on iNaturalist. And now she's doing it. So, and people in my community, same thing. People I never would have thought would be on iNaturalist. Now they're taking pictures of everything. So, I think awareness is probably one of the best partners that we can have in this issue.
This is great. This is my favorite part of kind of these conversations. Like, what can we do? And yeah, Mark, I really appreciate that. I always think of Aldo Leopold when we think about how can we change people's behaviors, like have this land ethic around, like create a moral compass for people as they think about populations of organisms in general. And if you can create that mindset, then people are just going to act differently inherently. So I think that's one really important idea. And then all the other things that you all spoke about, like increasing the primary recipe for evolution. I mean, if we're going to have evolutionary systems, we need diversity, right? That's where diversity is selected from. And so in order to make adaptable systems, we need lots of diversity. So as much diversity as you can have, but not only in space, as you're all pointing out, but also in time. Pointing out with goldenrods, right? They're coming out late in the season with the purple asters or whatever they're the purple. I don't know what they're called. Is that they just call purple asters? I don't even know. Blue asters? The ones that come late in the season with goldenrods.
New England asters.
New England asters. Thank you.
Or
But that's the
Canadian.
thing that people don't really think about. Like they have flowers when they want flowers, and then in the fall they're not making sure that they have a diversity for all these pollinators, as all you pollinator biologists know better than me. Like there are at times in the season where you need lots of resources where they're not as commonly available when people have plants out, and etc. So I think that's important. And then thresholds for chemical use. Like I teach a lot of garden education programs, and my belief is I don't spray at all. And the reason why I don't spray at all is because I'm not a subsistence gardener. I grow a lot of food. We grow most of the food for our family. But if it's a bad season with cucumber beetle, it's a bad season for cucumber beetle. I'm just not going to have as many cucumbers this year. It's never that I lose my entire plot of everything for all the insects. There's good in seasons based upon lots of different factors that are going to affect different insects differently every year. I don't know why. Don't ever ask me why it's a good cucumber season or a bad one, because there's so many complex reasons why. I just say don't spray. Like but if you really love tomatoes, we'll protect your tomatoes in a better way. You really can pay attention, and the thresholds are very low for gardeners, and they don't need to be. For farmers, it's a different thing, right? I think that if it's your livelihood and you need to provide, you have a different threshold. We use actual economic thresholds for IPM. I think that's fine, but we should really be thinking about using a lot less chemicals and just being okay with not having cucumbers all the time or every season, just dealing with it. And again, that's my personal opinion, unless you really love cucumbers. And then the final piece is like Spencer, I'm so glad you talked about the consumer side and how like we should not be buying these commodity-based products, but and why people grow commodity-based products. And I think it's just because our commodity-based system is connected to our economic system. If they weren't traded on a market, the only way you can trade on a market is if you have homogeneous products. And the only way to create homogeneous products is to grow them in a homogeneous environment, right? So you can't, that's the thing. Like no one's dragging their commodities to a market anymore and people are paying for them. You just assume that corn in California is the same as the corn in Iowa. So you buy it. And the only way to make sure that they're the same is that you grow them the same. And so we're like, if we don't decouple our economic markets from our commodity system, we can't break out of this. And so it's the economics, and like famously, it's the economics, stupid, right? So it's like, I don't know. That's the other thing that really, yeah, I don't know how to break that. Until we can kind of not trade our food on a market, I don't think we're going to stop commodities driving our food system. But anyways, I didn't mean to end on a negative note. But.
Well, I appreciate that, Vic. But one thing in my mind is that economic markets aren't static and stuff like that, and people can reevaluate, their practices or best practices and stuff like that. I mean, just coming home from my period at Marshfield, there's dozens of acres of herbicide just for corn, not only just for corn, but for cow corn, which how necessary it even is it. But I'm just saying there could be a different way of approaching that use versus just herbicide and growing one product. Some of these things just need to be reevaluated or even changed.
Yeah, like Spencer was saying, and like regional food systems. I think the more regional, locally based food systems, we can really tackle this economic issue. I hope, in my opinion, I should say.
That's a great opinion. Does anyone else have anything else to add to that? All righty. Well, thank you everybody for your insight again. And we'll move on to our next question, which is what conservation or policy initiatives have already exist in Vermont, and what would you like to see implemented?
I think I just want to touch on the previous question. I'll touch real quick on, Spencer's done a lot of work with bees, but there's a lot of information lacking for lepidoptera and what a basic community is. So it'd be good to have that kind of information at some point in time. But we talked about, I guess the previous question was community science or what not, and there's just so much information that can be attained through that. Some of it I didn't catch, but natural history information. I mean, people observing things that we don't observe, localities. I mean, we can't be every place at one time, so we can go on INET and see where we can find something. It's also a good source for range extension for things. It's also a place for finding new species, greater understanding of insects, and some indication of what's abundant or rare in the state. through INET and community science.
I can jump into the
Sorry.
question about state or programs and initiatives that exist, and I'll give a shout out to Mark and the state wildlife action plans that he wrangles or helps wrangle. Um, I think not other states, not all states are legally allowed to include invertebrates or do include invertebrates on their wildlife action plans. So I feel like we've already got a leg up in that our action plans for wildlife management include invertebrates. And I mean, 10 years ago, there were some bumblebees on there, and this year there'll be a bunch of native bees on there, lots of butterflies and macroinvertebrates, aquatic invertebrates as well. And then one pet peeve of mine that I keep harping to anyone that'll listen to on, in terms of things that I think could change, is the importation of mason bees. You can buy these pupa or cocoons of mason bees for pollination in your garden, basically. They're marketed online for homeowners and for like tiny home orchards. And you get these cocoons that were raised in California or Washington or who knows where. And you let them go in the garden, and they're supposed to help with your pollination of your fruit trees and your tomatoes and cucumbers and whatnot. I don't think they're necessary in Vermont because we have a healthy wild mason bee population. And B, I think that there's high likelihood that they're going to bring in nasty parasites or diseases, um, bacterial, fungal, viral, or other insect parasites that are going to spread and cause havoc to our wild mason bees, which maybe is already happening. But it's something that I think would be an easy thing to address at the state level. Although with online commerce, it's kind of hard to control. But that's my one little thing that I think we can work on.
I'll go next. I think we skipped one, but I can go. As far as regulations go, I think we're doing pretty well in Vermont. I mean, we don't have regulations that are specifically directed at invertebrate abundance and biomass issues, but we do have regulations, development laws, land development laws that focus on wildlife habitat and natural community protection, which I think goes a long way in conserving invertebrates when you do it on that scale. Because if you're trying to protect one species at a time, I mean that's kind of what I do for some of my work. But if we can do it at a larger scale, that's much better. And I think the laws that we have in place, and many states have these types of laws, I think that's a really good approach. Especially if we can identify important habitats and important places in the state where insect diversity is really high, and focus on those spots. I think that's a good way to go. I also think that our conservation community is very strong here. Non-regulatory type of work that's going on. You think of land trusts and conservation committees in our towns. NGOs that are out there doing the kind of work that Spencer's doing, and all of these working together, and then including land protection and acquisition to protect some of these important spots. I think that's really there's a lot of that going on in Vermont, and I think that's really positive. And of course, as we said, we've got a lot going on with trying to catalog what's out there on the landscape, and we've been doing that for over 20 years now on a large scale. So I think that type of work is really helping to inform some of that other land protection that's going on.
I guess one quick thing that I'll add is the the Pollinator Protection Act that Vermont legislature just passed last year, which is hoping to phase out the use of neonics in Vermont, specifically on neonic treated field crops like corn and soy, which can spread into the environment either as dust drift or leaching through the soil, or it's systemic, so taken up into plants and then being expressed in pollen or nectar. So that's very promising, especially for there's a good amount of evidence suggesting that these seed treatments were also not providing significant pest relief, and that there will be avenues as well for producers to have access to neonics in emergency scenarios if there's a pest outbreak or something that warrants that use. So having that avenue for producers at this time. So I think that will be in 2029, and then in the more short term in 2025, the focus is more on restricting outdoor use in cases like ornamental plants, where it's really just a cosmetic purpose. Do we really want to be contributing that level of risk to insect populations when it's just for our own visual purposes? So yeah, that's very promising and exciting for me.
I'm learning a lot. I don't know a lot about the kind of the conservation initiatives centered around insects per se, but so this has been great. I'm gonna take this back to my classes. But one thing I'm curious if anyone knows, whatever happened to the Payment for Ecosystem Services working group? I know that was something that was a few years ago. Chuck Ross was starting with Taylor Ricketts and people like that in Vermont. And so those that don't know, the basic idea was paying farmers literally for providing ecosystem services for bees, pollinators, so all sorts of different things, water resources, et cetera, and actually getting monetary compensation for practices that we're doing that were benefiting these things. So I'm just curious. Again, it seems like monetizing ecosystem services seems like antithetical to what I believe, but I feel like it's an on-ramp towards what Mark was talking about before, in the sense of creating some sort of ethic. And sometimes, sadly, my own opinion, sometimes revenue and profit can lead to ethical considerations also. And so it's a start. And I'm just curious if anyone else knows about whatever happened to that working. I know it was it was really in the news a few years ago.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that went.
Me as well. But one thing, so American Farmland Trust, they're working with NRCS on a ecosystem service, specifically just for, I think, carbon storage in pastures. But that's one initiative that's going on in some counties in Vermont.
Great. Is there anything else to add here? Well, thank you guys all for those answers. And maybe to cheer it up a little bit, what makes you guys hopeful for the future?
I do a lot of presentations with both audiences that are more geared toward presentations that are more geared towards farmers or the general public. And I'd say just the love and excitement people have for insects nowadays is really encouraging. When I'm out in a pasture talking with somebody and I'm sharing, research from UVM, like by Bryony Sands, who does a lot of great dung beetle research, and just the amount of excitement that they have on dung beetles and the motivation they have to help their populations out in pasture is really exciting to see. So that seems to be increasing. I also would say that before I'm in my current position, I used to work managing and monitoring habitat for the Karner blue butterfly, which is an endangered butterfly with isolated populations in the Northeast, mainly New York and New Hampshire. But we were establishing a new area of habitat before I left, and it was about 5 years ago. And I just went to that habitat last weekend. And it was it was well connected with other already existing areas of habitat. But just seeing how many butterflies, both Carners and frosted elfins, which was a threatened butterfly, had colonized the site, and all sorts of other organisms that, were thriving. It was really exciting to see that, when you're putting that conservation effort forward and you see that direct benefit and that direct, increase in habitat and landscape and how it's being utilized is really rewarding.
Yeah, I'll second both of those things. I also do a fair number of public presentations, and I feel like the audience is more and more engaged and more interested and more knowledgeable, even in the last couple years than they were previously. And then, yeah, insects, because they're short-lived and reproduce really rapidly, the changes in the, like, I feel like small changes at the small yard landscape level can have really quick impacts on abundance and diversity of insects. And it's cool to see that happen in real time in our lifetimes. And it gives me hope that this is we can turn the tide fairly quickly with insects if the willpower is there.
Yeah, I'd say in Vermont it's probably easier to be hopeful than a lot of places, just because the way it is. And just knowing that people here can really work to hold on to a place like Vermont and protect the landscape, that gives me hope. And even though the environmental community right now is suffering from actions being taken at a national level, I feel like we've been here before, and it's really hurts right now. But it has happened in the past, and my hope is that from all of this that we will see a new environmental movement at some point that rises again as it has in the future.
Well, I mean, one of the things I'm really hopeful about that y'all like even organized this conversation, like it was unexpected invitation, and it was really lovely to have the opportunity to hear from all these awesome folks doing awesome work. So that gives me a lot of hope that I mean, I work in entomology. We're a small state, and I've never been in the same room by any of these people, and it's like pretty amazing. Or maybe I have, I just didn't. We were watching, or we weren't. You know what I mean? But that's one thing. And then just honestly, I think there's a pretty, I don't know if negative, but there's not sometimes people don't paint a great picture of the students that are coming through university systems right now, like this generation, how they're on social media all the time, and they're not engaging with the out. So they can handle complexity in a way that I was not able to. And maybe it's because these are really complex questions and complex problems, and they don't think I had to break through that linear way of thinking, and honestly, they're able to maybe to their detriment. I don't even know, but they're able to do a lot of more complex things, multitask, and all these things, and think and see the both sides of things in a way that I wasn't able to, and maybe they can figure out ways to thread the needle of some of these really, as they say, wicked problems. So that's what gives me hope, are all these students that I get the opportunity to be in the room with and learning communities with.
Yeah, I concur with directors. A lot of UVM students and other students throughout the state doing some great work on invertebrates. And the other things that give me hope, one is that people care in itself. I mean, a lot can go on their radar if nobody cares. And the third thing that I find really interesting is iNaturalist itself. I mean, you see all these people doing faunistic tallies of their backyard or their county or their state. So, I mean, it's just getting people more interested in the outside and in photography and what's around them.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for a nice hopeful note for us to end our questions on. And with that, we'll transition into a couple quick questions from the chat, and feel free to just kind of pop in if you have an answer. No worries if you don't. But yeah, so our first question was about herbicides and how much they, to what extent they can be insecticides. So if people are using herbicides in like on their land, like are they incapacitating insects without realizing it?
I'm two quick thoughts is, one of the main concerns with herbicides is just potential losses of habitat, if you're applying it to an area that's reducing plant diversity. I will say that herbicides, and I'm not the most knowledgeable person on this topic, but can lead to sublethal effects on certain insect populations depending on the herbicide. But yeah, so there's that risk as well.
And
Oh, and
sorry, bees are herbivores, and if you kill all the weeds everywhere, then you're losing a lot of floral diversity, especially for the generalists that don't mind if it's a introduced dandelion or a wild mustard or something.
I tend to consider herbicides as synonymous with insecticides. I don't think they're innocuous.
just kind of another quick comment of, some people who I see with good intentions of, if they have an old field or something like that where it's dominated by goldenrod and asters, but maybe there's some undesirable species within there too, like maybe also dominated cool season pasture grasses that are non-native. And so, applying herbicides to those areas with the intention of restoring them to a different plant community, I think is well intended, but there's also pre-existing resources that you're getting rid of that are maybe, within a native seed bank that's well adapted for those sites, that's still providing, a significant amount of resources for pollinators in particular.
I don't really know a lot about this subject, but one thing I would point out is that some herbicide, well, there's the active ingredient in herbicides, and there's often something called a surfactant, which is used for absorption. And I know in some amphibians that's been shown to actually be the culprit in toxicity. And I believe in invertebrates that can be the case as well. So it's not just the active ingredient you necessarily have to think about.
I was just going to quickly say in response to that question that there might be other ways of handling that problem.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you for the insight on kind of the variety of cascading effects we can see from herbicides. And we're almost at time, but I am pretty curious personally about the other question in the chat, so I'm also going to throw it out there. So Sarah mentioned bee hotels and other kind of DIY insect shelters. What are your guys' thoughts on that? Do they help insects? Can they do more harm than good? What do you need to know if you want to set one up in your backyard?
I just put a link into the chat with some information that I've put together, including I think there's some Xerces stuff in there. I get this question a lot. I think they're a really useful education tool. If you put it in a prominent spot, it's a great way to get bees where you want them, to see them and to photograph them, and to teach your neighbors about them. If left unmanaged, they can build up diseases and pests and parasites. If your only goal is conservation, it's a lot faster and more efficient to just leave the goldenrod stems, leave the rotting logs. But I think there's a place for bee hotels, especially if they're well managed. And there's details in that link that I just posted.
Thanks.
Awesome. Well, unless anyone else has more to add about that, I would assume that the resource Spencer's compiled is going to be pretty comprehensive. So yeah, we'll give a minute or two if anyone else has any other questions they'd like to throw in the chat or just unmute for.
Can I just make one announcement?
Sure.
The Vermont Entomological Society has a newsletter, which is a good venue for sharing things related to entomology. It's kind of for members, but I think I treat it as literally a Vermont newsletter. So people have things of interest or they want to share or notifications, et cetera, et cetera. That's a good, good venue. And we also have a web page, vermontinsects.org, if people want to find out more information.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great plug. And I see we have a question about statewide listings of native plant nurseries. Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe we have one that Sarah can put in the chat right now that I think is pretty comprehensive. All right. Awesome. So yeah, as we wrap things up, I guess one last ask from our panelists. Is there any subject that you were really excited to touch on that that you think we missed? Any last resources or thoughts to share out?
I have a question for the pollinator biologist. Just the overabundance of plastic being used on farms, in both like for plastic mulch and the increasing use of high tunnels and plastic. And what do you see as like this impact? Because I get this question a lot, and I'm curious as to what you all think about that. So I didn't mean to be like a panel questioner, but
That's an interesting one, and I've thought about it a little bit especially with greenhouses, where you get on a nice warm sunny day and the sides are open, the top corners just fill with insects, most of which die in the next couple days as it gets hot. I keep a box of bees that I've pulled out of the sides of various greenhouses. There's a lot of species in there. Maybe there's a way to build some little hole that lets them out. It's been in the back of my mind for a while. And I've also wondered about fabrics, row cover and plastic is smothering insects that are nesting, preventing emergence. I don't know of any resources on the topic, but it's something that's definitely crossed my mind, and I'd be curious to dig further into it.
Something that I've thought about, and there's really limited research on potential impacts on invertebrates, but our PFAS, with that being of increasing interest for so many different audiences, but potentially what limited research there is on, effects on wildlife and potentially on effects of invertebrates. So that's something that just kind of is in the back of my mind that I'm always looking for more papers on of, because it can be expressed in plants, how that might be influencing. And of course, with, we recommend site preparation methods like tarping over, existing plant communities to shade them out to establish new communities, and potentially that, contributing to PFAS levels. But yeah, that's a topic that I still think needs to be dived into a lot more in research to have a good understanding.
All right. Awesome. Well, I think on that note, we'll wrap things up so we don't keep people too over time. So yeah, on behalf of all of us at Audubon Vermont, huge thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time to be here with us, especially on a Wednesday evening. It was really a treat to have you guys all here sharing your perspectives. One plug that I feel like I need to bring up, because we are Audubon Vermont and our focus is bird conservation. We kind of got into this a bit, but what's good for insects tends to also be good for birds and also be good for wildlife in general and biodiversity. So don't consider what you've heard here in a vacuum. It's going to benefit birds, it's going to benefit pretty much everything. So yeah, thank you guys. I know I learned a lot, and gained more appreciation for what we're doing in Vermont. It's pretty unique. And thank you to Sarah for all their invaluable help getting this event together. And thank you to our attendees. We hope you learned something as well. But with that, I think we'll wrap it up, and you guys have a great rest of your night.
You as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.